Still going. Okay. I think we're live. It's always hard to tell if we're live or not. But we'll go ahead and start. I'm going to share mine real quick. On my page. Alrighty. Well, welcome everyone. This is our week 13 of our Native Wellness Power Hours. I cannot believe that we've been doing these for 3 months already. We kind of didn't have an end date in mind, but given that we're still in the pandemic, this was the Native Wellness Institute's response to the pandemic, because we knew that an already traumatized people would be re-traumatized in this pandemic. And we wanted to do our part in bringing uplifting, positive messages and programming to you. So thank you all for tuning in. My name is Jillene Joseph. I am a member of the Aani people, and actually I'm wearing my shirt today, the Aani Indian. And I am the executive director of the Native Wellness Institute. And this year also, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary. So a very eventful time in our country and a very eventful time to be celebrating our 20th year. So given the revolution that we're in, we wanted to do our part and to help to bring information in order to bring awareness, in order to help bring some terminology and understanding to some of the stuff that we're seeing and experiencing out there. And today we have two amazing, awesome friends of NWI, friends of mine personally, who have been doing this anti-racism and anti-oppression work for a long, long time. And they're allies to Indian country. They're allies to the Native Wellness Institute, and we welcome them. So Lynn and Wendi, thank you both so much for agreeing to be on our Power Hour today. And we were already talking about doing, you know, a part 1 and a part 2 and a part 3 of today's show, because there's so much to cover. So let's just jump right in. And Lynn, we'll start with you first. You want to just introduce yourself and also share like what motivates you to do this work?
Sure. Well, I'm in Boston at the moment, and I'm actually on what used to be the Massachusetts tribe land, Wampanoag. And let's see, where do I start? So I have a background in journalism and working with youth who were gang involved or court involved or otherwise labeled at risk, and dealing with systems. And then I've been working with white people specifically on anti-racism and anti-oppression strategies in their organizations for about 10 years through training, technical assistance, facilitating large groups, small groups, all of that. And I actually hosted a monthly talking circle with white women in leadership in the sexual and domestic violence field for like 20 years, and worked in a shared organizational leadership, shared power model with a woman of color, and did that for 10 years. So I'm either really bad at it or really tenacious. So, and it's because of all of those experiences that I need to be doing this work.
Awesome. Thank you, Lynn. And Wendi, how about you? Can you introduce yourself and tell us about what motivates you to do this work?
Sure. Oki Nixukwa, Nistu Nudaniko, my Stupi Daki. My name's Wendi Siebold, and I wanted to give a little hello to my folks out in Blackfeet, Skapi Pekuni country. And thank you, Jillene, for inviting us to be on the call today. We were laughing before the call. I was kind of like, uh-oh. We'll get the white people on camera and see what they'll say. But it's so important. And yeah, I am on Tlingit Aani, Tlingit land up here in Juneau, Alaska. I was raised in Southern California, and I've lived most of my life in the Western region. And when I was thinking about what got me into a more, I would say, conscious engagement in being anti-racist as a white person, I think it honestly didn't happen, and this is part of what I think needs to be addressed. It didn't happen until I actually had the privilege of going to college up in Berkeley, and I was going for a walk in a neighborhood and walked by this park, and the sign said Ohlone Park, and I was like, how do you say that? Ohlone. And I was like, what is that? And then I went back, and that was when the internet was invented, right? So I was like, I'll try this internet thing to see what that is, and was able to find out, of course, that, you know, historically and currently Ohlone lands, right? And I was like, what? Why didn't I know that? And I was embarrassed. And it started this whole process, I think, for me personally, to really understand how, I would say, protected from reality I was as a white middle-class person growing up in Southern California, and that I did not know really, I think, anything, especially about indigenous culture or the history of the land I was on, et cetera. And so that was obviously disturbing to me, and that began, just kind of my personal commitment to it, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to just dive right in because we have lots to cover today, and we're going to start with the big question first, the R word. So what is racism? And I'll leave it to you two. Who wants to go first?
Up to you, Wendi. Want first dibs? I think it's coming around to both of us. So
yeah.
Well, I had the actual definition pulled up on my phone, but I don't have it right here. But what I'll say off the cuff, and this is not the literal definition. I think, Lynn, you have a funny story, funny, not so funny story about definitions and what we consider knowledge and referencing, right? About challenging this definition, but it's the systematic denial of people's of their rights based off of what is identified as their race by themselves or others, or however you want to say it. That is not a scientific definition. But I think we'll talk about this today, but there's big R and maybe little r. There's lots that goes into it. So we're starting with a big word, but it contains a lot of things, as you all know. Lynn, what was that story? I love that story that you told.
Which one?
The woman writing to Merriam-Webster and saying, hello, what about systemic racism?
Yes, a young Black woman who looked up in the dictionary, the Merriam-Webster dictionary that she found online, and did not like the definition at all because it didn't include the word systemic. So she wrote to them, and they responded, and they are working on changing that definition. So it's kind of cool. But you know what? It's also missing the word power. And I didn't see her email, but I'm not sure if that came through or not. So I'm writing to see if I get a response. The way that I learned the definition of racism, it's important to include the word power, because racism is race prejudice plus social and institutional power. And that creates a whole system of advantage and oppression based on race, right? So, and that system is called white supremacy. So, and that's why you can't have reverse racism, because wherever the power is, that's who has control. So,
yeah,
that's right.
Thank you for that.
Go
ahead, Wendi.
I was just going to say that example of that woman writing to the dictionary company, the publisher, and saying, what about systemic issues? Racism is systemic. That is a perfect, I think, example of how seemingly tiny institutionalized racism comes out in like a million different ways. Like, that is an example of institutionalized racism, because people look at a dictionary to define their language, especially the white colonial English language, right? That's used in all of these systems of power. And so if that dictionary doesn't include an accurate definition of racism, that's institutionalized racism right there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Exactly. And yeah. So speaking of systemic racism, like what is that? And what are some examples of that?
Mm.
Lynn?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, if racism is about race prejudice, and then the whole layer of social and institutional power, what that does is it supports the cultural beliefs and the values, or the cultural beliefs and the values actually support that, right? So it's like it's an indoctrination of sorts. So all of those values based on white supremacy get upheld, and they get buoyed basically by every system that you can think of. And so I usually talk about systemic and institutional, because that covers the whole gamut, right? So I mean, we could go on forever, but housing and banking and education, social services, child welfare, the courts, law enforcement, entertainment, corporate and nonprofit organizations, nonprofit America has been colonized as well by white supremacy. So, and that's why it's not about a person. Yes, a person can be racist in their behavior. But that's, if that were the problem, we'd be done with it a long time ago.
Yeah, I like somebody shared with me one time, if individuals weren't racist, the system still would be, so it would still be there, right? So I think that's what we're trying to do here, is just like help people understand that. And I'm trying to look at the comments and stuff, and Lynn, you had mentioned reverse racism and how that's not really a thing. Like we can't have reverse racism because of the power piece to it, right?
That's right.
Brown and Black people, we can be bigoted and prejudiced and discriminatory and lateral oppressive, and so that's why I think it's really important to like understand these concepts and to see how they play out. Wendi, do you have any further insight to systemic racism and examples of how that plays out?
Well, yeah, I'll be honest. When we discussed talking about this on today's Power Hour, it felt kind of awkward, because I was thinking, not only, of course, every group of people of color in this country has experienced and does experience systemic racism, and white people benefit from it, but I can't think of a more prominent group of peoples on this land that have experienced systemic racism than Indigenous folks. This country was built off of systemic racism and policies related to that, with the whole manifest destiny idea of westward expansion. I mean, the U.S. government, the federal government, literally had laws in place like the Allotment Act, which is also known as the Dawes Act or settlement, that, it basically took land away from already shrunken lands of Indigenous people by reservation, and gave it to white people, made it available for white people. And there are many layers of just even that one policy that was extremely detrimental to Indigenous peoples. And I didn't even know that policy existed. Here's again an example of how ignorant, and I say that in the literal definition of ignorant, like I didn't know. When I was doing work up with the Nimipu up in northern Idaho, and we were driving around on the res from school to school, and it was obvious that there were like white-owned companies on what I thought we were on the reservation. And I was like, what are these white companies, logging companies right on the river here? And that was the first time. That wasn't until I was in my 20s, right? So our country, and again, this is another example of institutionalized racism, the general public, especially white people in school settings, are not taught with any kind of honesty about the level of racist policy that this country has put forward, and its then detrimental effects to many generations of people now. So, yeah, that's all I want to offer right now. There's so much.
No, thank you.
I know that. Yeah, thank you. There is so much, and you know, we were kind of visiting before the show started, and I was giving you both an example of how years and years ago we did a women's gathering and a men's gathering, same time, same place, but separate rooms. And on the last day, the men came over and, you know, knocked on the door and asked for permission to come into our space. We gave them permission. They came in, they circled us, they danced and sang and circled us. And then we're on this side of the room, the women were on this side of the room. And for hours, they apologized to the women who represented, you know, their partners and mothers and sisters, etc. And they apologized for things that they did or didn't do. Like there wasn't a dry eye in the room. And then the women returned and did the same thing. And this like 6-hour process, the women were saying, I've never heard men talk like that before. I've never heard Native men like apologize and say things like that before, you know? And so that was my thought for this conversation. Like this isn't a norm. Like we don't hear conversations like this in a good way. You know, we don't hear white people talking about racism and all of this kind of stuff. So I'm so grateful for today. And, you know, again, grateful for you both for joining us. So we're going to continue digging in. And the next question is, how would you define white privilege, and why did people get so upset with that term? So Lynn, do you want to go first?
Oh, white people. You go ahead, Lynn. Let's start chipping away at this one.
I know. So I have my theory. And there's a lot, I mean, people have been talking about white privilege for a really long time, and people have been on the other end of white privilege for a long time. For me, as a white person, and what I've been through myself and witnessed through other processes, is that it offends people, right? Because, well, first of all, we talked about race as benefiting one particular race, right? And so we're talking about the obvious, right? That white people have the benefit. And so I think it offends white folks for two reasons. And this is in general, because, I don't speak for all white people. But I think, and particularly for, well, let's just say that we hate the whole notion of unearned birth privilege, right? We hate that because just sort of based on the beliefs and the values and the systems that we've grown up with, of this whole notion of like not enoughness. Like everything, there's never enough of anything, right? So we're always in this competitive thing, and I think that translates primarily to economic disadvantage, because that's something that people can get their heads around, that white people can get their heads around. And it pulls nicely into the whole thing of like pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, and your success is based on you as an individual. It's not unearned, you earned it. You got there because you did it. Yay. And then I think the second one, the second reason it offends us, and I think this is particularly for white women, in my experience, we really do believe that privilege is inherently unfair. And to have to wear that, I think just shakes our whole identity. Or at least my identity. Again, I don't speak for all white people, but I think that's the gate you got to go through, is that it doesn't change anything about who you are. You just now know who you are, basically.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lynn. Wendi, how about you?
Well, there's some really great resources that I do want to offer that and we'll talk about, I think, at the end. But there are some more recently written resources that really unpack what white privilege is and what white people's problems are with acknowledging it. I think Lynn brought up a couple really good points that I obviously agree with the unearned privilege. And sometimes for me, it helps to make it an example. Like we're trying to tell white people who have benefited from this kind of privilege their entire lives without even knowing it. Remember, like I didn't even know I was on Indian land when I was like until my 20s or 18 or whatever, right? Like that's scary and horrible. And so then we're trying to tell white people that, hey, guess what? Like you benefited from this, and you continue to benefit from this. And yeah, like white women, obviously, a lot of people start to feel guilty, like well-meaning white folks who aren't bad people feel guilty, like, oh God, how did that, right? So then what do they do with that guilt? And, you know, then there's that notion of white women's tears. And I encourage any white folks, especially white women who are listening or doing this work, to read everything they can about this idea of white women's tears, because white women have so much power when it comes to, especially in a setting with men of color, as we saw more recently in our national news. You know, it's abhorrent. And so white women have to be aware of the kind of power they have, even if they're feeling sad and apologetic or whatever they're unpacking. Like the space to do that is not with people of color. It's definitely not around men of color with calling the cops on them, right? Like white women really need to check themselves in a very specific way, which I think is very important. But again, back to the pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's hard to get people to understand a system that they have not had to understand or acknowledge their entire lives. I can walk down the street, I can go into a bank and not even think about it. I go shopping, I'll walk around whatever store I'm in, nobody follows me, nobody says anything to me, I don't get looks. You know, like I don't experience all these microaggressions that people of color experience on a daily basis. And so then all of a sudden I'm being told, well, I'm the reason this is happening. Like I'm making this happen more and I'm benefiting from it, is a lot to unpack, which doesn't mean white people shouldn't be unpacking it. It means they should be unpacking it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you both. This one time, Lynn and I and a couple of other colleagues were doing some work, anti-racism, anti-oppression work, and we were having a conversation and a white woman started crying and got up and left the room. So that's also, it shuts down the conversation, right? Because like no one knows what to do when people cry or, you know, whatever. So we waited for her to come back, and she came back and I said, you know, are you okay? And I said, because we're going to continue on the conversation now. And then like in a really respectful way, I said, you know, when you cry and run out of the room, like that shuts the conversation down. So now we're going to practice setting new norms, and we're going to continue the conversation. So like this is what today is about too, like helping people navigate this and how to do it in a good way. Right. So, Lynn, real quick, I know your story about when you had this awareness about white privilege, you know, your Dunkin' Donuts story. So would you mind just like sharing that about like when you discovered white privilege?
There's so many Dunkin' Donuts stories because that's the place to go to practice anti-racism.
Especially if you're in Boston, eh?
Exactly. Well, and you know, East Coast in general. And, you know, I was thinking of your story too, Wendi. And, you know, it was well after college for me because I dragged around this hard scrabble, tough guy sort of identity for a really long time. Like it was really hard to get rid of. You know, and it is a phenomenon for some reason, and someday, you know, really going to dig into it, but why, you know, particularly white folks are always trying to identify with wherever that intersection is that they have oppression, wherever they're the targeted group, why, you know, why that holds the identity rather than the notion of privilege. So there were, you know, there were a few incidents at Dunkin' Donuts, which is like right around the corner, and you get right by the train and then pop on there in the morning. And, you know, I started to notice it was getting into my consciousness because it was being drilled into my consciousness based on where I was working at the time, where I was no longer the, representative of the majority, which is also a false thing too. And still really resistant. And, Dunkin' Donuts one day, and there was a comment about the dumb immigrants behind the counter. And it actually hit me because now I had become, I knew people. So it became relevant to me. And that's where it started to come. And so I did say something, and I also started to notice when I would get waited on first. And then, another situation of somebody from, and I'm making assumptions, but somebody who had their own target decided to call one of the women out from behind the counter. And, just to kind of blurt it out across the place. And that was the time that I was able to approach that person outside of Dunkin' Donuts and ask him why he felt that was okay. And, had he ever experienced it based on how he presented? Mm-hmm. And we ended up having a conversation. It was wild. And that's when it popped for me. And then I was like, then I had my privilege cave on for a while. You know how you have early stages of sobriety? You have early stages of allyship too. And that's what prompted
Absolutely.
my early stage, where I was like, yeah.
Absolutely.
And then you want to tell everybody.
I want to tell everybody.
Yeah.
And I want to point out this and this and this and this. And,
Yeah.
You learn later that that's not really how it rolls.
Right. But you see the world through a different lens,
completely
lens, right?
And totally.
Then you see it everywhere, right? Yeah.
That's right. You can't not.
Yeah.
You can't not.
So I think this is good too, like having the definition, because it helps like everyone see it clearly, right? So moving on from white privilege, now let's take a look at like white fragility and white silence. So Wendi, do you want to take the first at that?
Yeah, and I think we started to touch on it a little bit with that concept of white women's tears, right? And there's a few resources out there now, some that have been adapted really recently with a lot of the racial uprisings against racism that have been going on. And they talk about like different, like socially accepted types of racism, or socially accepted is the big underground, like the iceberg that you can't see is most of it. And then you have unacceptable types of racism that's really obvious. But another figure that's came out starts with like what Lynn was referring to, is the kind of stages of kind of understanding or becoming what could be considered a white ally, or just understanding our place in this work. And the first stage is often fear, closely followed by denial. And I think a lot of that white fragility comes from this. And by white fragility, I think we're talking about, that white people, again, if you have never had to experience oppression because of the color of your skin, and if you're talking about like I'm just going to go down the list, right? Like the stereotype, a heterosexual white cisgender man who's, of decent, like he's got a somewhat high income, full-time job. He's got a house he lives in, no problem with housing, got a car, like he's got all these things, right? He will not understand what oppression feels like. He doesn't feel it because he's not oppressed. And so when white people are told like, hey, this is what you're supporting and holding up with the society, unless you do something about it, like you need to take action, or here's something you did that's actually hurtful to me, and they're, even gently corrected, even by another white person. But this often happens when it's a person of color correcting them, and using up that emotional energy to do so, which is unfortunate. they, crumple under the pressure and, get defensive. And there was a meme going out, I don't know, on social media recently, which was like, it was related to the pandemic and all those, yes, mostly white people and mostly white men, but mostly white people who were protesting on Capitol steps saying, we don't want to wear our masks, like we're free, and here we've got our guns and F you all, we've, like, I wasn't surprised at all it was a bunch of white people doing that. Again, because they're the most fragile, they don't get it. Like, for them, having somebody tell them just to wear a mask for the better of humanity so people don't die, so that, that's not oppression. And there's that meme going around that's like, when you haven't experienced oppression, something as simple as wearing a mask or anybody telling you what to do at all is, even at Costco, I heard stories of white people going to Costco, and Costco they've been turning away people if they don't have a mask. And the white people were really upset. They're like, well, how dare you turn me away? Guess what? They haven't been ever turned away for services before. And it feels sad to me emotionally to even say that, knowing who's probably watching this, because that's really sad, probably to hear too. I don't know, but it's sad for me to even think about that people don't experience that level of racism every day, and other people do.
Yeah, that's funny too, because I just saw a video, local self-video of a woman with a very screechy, the real Massachusetts accent at like level 10, who wanted to go to, we have Market Basket here. She wanted to go to the Market Basket, and they wouldn't let her in because she didn't have a mask on, and she raised so much hell, they gave up. And and then you juxtapose that with what's been happening, like every day. It's a new thing, like, no more healthcare for, transgender folks, and there's nobody talking about that. Nobody. So, it's interesting. So it's sad. Interesting.
You bring up a really good point, Lynn. If you don't mind, Jillene, if I just mention real quick something that I've learned on my journey in this work is the idea that, and I think it's important for white people to understand, that you can be privileged as a white person. You have unearned white privilege because of your skin color. You do not, you experience benefits in society just because of how you look. And at the same time, you can be oppressed in other ways. And that's the piece that needs to be, I think, really unpacked with a lot of white people. There's a couple things you can find online where people have talked about it. Like a lot of poor white folks are like, I don't have white privilege. I'm poor. What you're looking, I don't have retirement. I'm poor. I'm, day to day. I have an hourly job I may not even have my job anymore because of this pandemic, right? So how could I have white privilege? And that's really important. White people are raised in this very black and white, very dichotomous world. We don't live in a continuous circular world. We live in a dichotomous. It's this or that. It's very linear. And so if you say I have privilege, that means everything about me is privileged. But that's not the case with this, right? Like, we all have multiple identities. Like, I identify as a two-spirit person. So Lynn's absolutely right. Like, people receiving healthcare who are trans folks, transsexual folks who are part of that, or transgender folks who are part of that two-spirit community, are being oppressed, right, with their access to healthcare because of stigma about who they are as a human being. And so, but they could be white and cisgender in their, it's just like, it gets very, very complicated. And so they still have white privilege too, as do other white folks.
Yeah, really good point. Really good point.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so now we're going to move into another area about microaggressions and examples of them. Like, how do microaggressions play out? So, Lynn, do you want to start?
Microaggressions are very interesting in a sad kind of way, because, I'm just thinking about like the history of racism and oppression history, and how they're like, things are handed down to us, and we never think about it. We have no racial identity. We were never raised. We have a racial identity, but we don't know that. or, you know, we have to learn that, you know, when we walk into a room, we're not just us, you know, and, you know, I'm nice, and, you know, you must know I'm nice because I'm nice. But, you know, we've inherited all of this stink that sticks to our language, sticks to our brains, how we feel about things, what we value, what we don't value. And I feel like that's all connected to the microaggressions. And the microaggressions are those everyday insults, what they call like backhanded compliments. They can be assaultive, like, you know, they can be pretty violent in language. And they're hurtful. They're meant to hurt, and they're based on what we've learned about others. And so it comes out in language. It can come out in behaviors. I'm just going to go with like the Italians. That's my ancestry, and I grew up on so many jokes and not jokes about what I could do and what I couldn't do, just based on that. So, you know, there were, you know, there was the whole criminal background, you know, everybody's in the mob. There's the whole why Italians don't have freckles because they slide off, you know, because we were greasy, and, you know, all of those things. I'm not comparing this to racism at all. I'm just sort of where how the stereotypes impact things. And so they pop up. And when you're on the other end of them every single day, it's oppressive. And it's really about not being in touch. I think it links directly to the implicit bias piece. It's linked directly to our unconscious. It's when they become conscious that it becomes something different. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm meandering.
Yeah, but what you just said to me ties it right into that systemic racism, right? The more we've been talking, and microaggressions were defined in the 70s by some researcher, but we haven't really talked about them, at least as white people, more openly until the last few years, I'd say.
That's true.
And defined what it means. And like labeled it and said, ooh, that's a microaggression. This is why cumulatively, like you're saying, this is a damaging thing to have happening to whatever the target group is, in this case, people of color. And it's this huge foundation on which systemic racism is allowed to perpetuate, right? If I'm carrying around all of these basically stereotypical, bigoted ideas about a group of people, I'm not going to think twice about looking, like if I'm in a place of power and signing off on a policy, or even thinking about home loans or whatever, like think about redlining in the 30s. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's something, as a white person, if you don't know about redlining, go Google it. It was literally policy that was put into place by, again, the federal government about which kinds of bank loans were more or less desirable. The banks drew red lines around different areas of the city, like Detroit or Chicago. It happened all over the U.S. And so, which obviously has impacted people of color for generations if you can't build wealth based off of property ownership, which of course is built on the backs of indigenous people and their loss of their land, right? Like it all goes back. And I think microaggressions are a little bit, they're so important for us to talk about. And also they get really complex because I think it also offers some language that's really helpful for, again, unpacking some of what happens with racism as a whole, because microaggressions can actually happen between people of color too. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to kind of name that. Like I heard some really awful things in some indigenous only groups about like, Asian people or something. And like that, I won't call it racist, again, because people of color do not hold that institutional power of racism, but it is bigoted and it is a microaggression based off of some kind of racial stereotype. And so it's important for all of us to work so that we're more aware of, what our comments are based off of. Is this a stereotype of this entire group of people? Am I complimenting someone because they speak English well? because they look Asian, or, you know, and of course we have many examples in the media of stereotypes of different groups of people based on race that lead, again, to these microaggressive behaviors. Yeah. Do we need any more examples of that, or do you think that's good, Jillene?
Well, somebody was just asking for some more examples. Well, I have an example that yeah, just happened.
Go for it.
We were doing some work in a community this past week, and with teachers, mainly they were teachers, and this Native teacher was given an example of, she was finishing her master's and she was writing her final, paper, and she asked one of her colleagues, a white teacher, to proof her paper for her. So she did, and her comment to her was, "Wow, I didn't know you were so scholarly." Right? Like, that's an example of a microaggression. And then her response was, she didn't say anything because she didn't want to make her colleague feel bad. Right. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, right? Yeah. When we talk about internalized racism and internalized oppression, and maybe that will be a part of part 2 conversation.
Yeah. So yeah, because that's the whole thing. Like, people, people rush to, take care of the white person who's, we usually, instead of white women's tears, say something about it's over when the white chick cries, because that's the end of whatever we were talking about. So, and then someone's got to take care of them.
Yeah. What are just a few more examples of microaggressions?
Yeah, I think some that come to mind for me, especially maybe in Indian country that folks are experiencing and can identify with, is when somebody says, all Indians are rich, and they say it like that, or you're just a casino tribe, you're a casino Indian. Like, that is a racist microaggression, right? Mm-hmm. We know that it's based off of this assumption. Saying that people who are indigenous are lazy, or, can't keep track of time, so that means they're lazy. Again, like, so what would that show up as a microaggression? It would be like if I was in a group or something, and one of my indigenous friends showed up on time or early, and I expressed surprise and was like, "Whoa, hey, now you're on time. What's going on? You okay?" Right? Like, that's aggressive. I say it as a joke, and I'm smiling and like, ha ha ha, and they probably will smile and laugh too, because how awkward is it, right? So to have to call that out, and how much pressure on them to call that out and call a white person who has power out on that. But then, it's not fair. There's all these assumptions it's based off of. There's stuff online too you can look up. There's some really good tools that we can share afterwards too. Every microaggression is built off of some assumption about that person because of whatever identity you're assuming. Like following people of color in a store, Native people in Walmart have a different experience than a lot of white people in Walmarts around the country, right? And it's microaggression.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think even like language and word choice that you just sort of throw out, like, I don't know why dads and people at the office, say, hey, we're gonna, let's have a family powwow, or let's have a team powwow. It's just like, what? But if you're not paying attention and you don't have you're just spitting out, what you. And I think it's this, the thing with the microaggression is that the person who's throwing it can always back away and can always be like, it's just kidding, or I didn't mean that. Mm-hmm. Or even worse than that is, oh, you're so sensitive. Mm-hmm. It's like, you should let me just mess around, and like not have a reaction. Mm-hmm. Like, what's wrong with you for that? Stuff like that. I mean, I think that, in Massachusetts, everything is wicked. And, I haven't related it to the old witches who used to populate the area. But, I think I'm off the hook with that one. But, the latest one is savage. Like, kids are just like, everything is savage. And there's no relationship to that. And, particularly for natives. and and then also a myriad of other groups as well, but particularly for Natives, that one is tough.
I almost wore my Merciless Indian Savage shirt today.
There you go.
Yes.
So, but then the weirdest thing for me with microaggressions and the way that, current white culture connects is that at the same time, there's this whole notion of like appropriation and exoticism. So in one way, you're condemning a whole group of people, and at the same time, you're trying to be them. So, yeah, that's really conflicting for me. I don't know my way out of that one yet. But that, Halloween costumes and dream catchers and spirit animals. You can take a quiz on Facebook. It's a spirit animal. Like, really? That stuff. And maybe it's just because that stuff, coupled with the impacts on Natives in terms of the invisibility, and it's like the connections get lost for people, I think, from so they're still talking about cowboys and Indians, and because that's like all they know, and peace pipes, So
yeah.
I don't know. I think it would be really interesting to explore more around, or at least for me to explore more around. I'm sure somebody knows. But that's an area that just feels incongruous to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So, microaggressions, we all, aggressions or aggressiveness, but in a little tiny way. And there's a when I started, learning more about microaggressions, there's a video online that gives the analogy of a mosquito bite, right? A mosquito bite as a microaggression. But when you have a mosquito bite and another one,
exactly,
like that's an example of how it builds up over time, and so all of these, we started out by defining racism, and then we kind of started breaking it down about understanding systemic racism and institutional racism and examples of that. We looked at, white privilege and what is that, and white fragility and what is that, microaggressions, what is that? So these are all like a part of the bigger picture, right? So we're just trying to break down some major concepts here to help us all better understand. And so I wanted to also ask you about implicit and explicit bias. Like what is that, and how does that play out? So who wants to go first on that one?
I want to give an example that rocked my world. Again, probably because I was becoming more aware of my race, as weird as that sounds, when I went to college. But there's been studies done where people, where there's job applications, and the same, people are reviewing, the people who are hiring, supposedly it's part of a test, review the job applications, and the names that sound more Black, like if it says Jamal on one application, but everything else in the resume, everything else is exactly the same, and the other application says John, same everything else, it's statistically significant that John was more likely to get the job than Jamal. Mm-hmm. And so that is implicit bias. I mean, it might be explicit bias if somebody's like racist and read it, they think they're like, oh, I'm, I hate whatever. But most of the time it's implicit bias. And that's basically that somebody would have notions, all these negative stereotypes, negative connotations of, not respecting, of Black folks, of being, just have to basically be racist. And it comes out in ways that they don't even realize. So approving somebody for a job application, for example, it happens all the time. I don't know, Lynn, you might have better examples.
No, I mean, even the redlining too. I mean, it's like that. You just look at the numbers of folks that are able to get loans in a white neighborhood versus a Black neighborhood, and then look at the home ownership numbers, and they can really be in the same income range, things like that. For microaggressions come directly from implicit bias, right? And they can be unconscious. They're typically unconscious. You haven't made the connection because you don't have to relate to the world as a racial being. So you have no, and then, where's your humanity and your compassion or anything, but that's gone too, because that's not how you operate. So it's when, with your example of Jamal, when it becomes explicit is when you become aware of your own bias. And typically you become aware of your own bias. I think in my family, I had, I could have a bag for each bias, you know what I mean? Like, didn't matter, that was the way it rained down in my family. But it's the personal experience that you have with somebody who has a racial identity, or, that's not white, that what's amazing to me is that we see ourselves as individuals and end up in a lot of white fragility situations and reacting to, you don't see me? Like, it's me. I'm not just this, I'm me. But you have one or two interactions with somebody who has a particular racial identity, and then we can do that for the whole community. We can decide everybody's like that. They're not individuals. You know what I mean? Suddenly that's all lost. And so when it becomes conscious and you do it in that way, that's explicit. And then it gets really nasty. Microaggression, I think when people get called out on it, when that happens, that gets you thinking. And then if you do it anyway, that's something different altogether. And they're all pieces of what upholds the supremacy of systemic racism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to mention that every one of us carries implicit bias that we don't know. Implicit means that you aren't aware of it, like Lynn was saying. And so, even people of color have implicit bias about something. And it's not just about a racial bias. It could be about other kinds of bias, like bias about people of a certain weight, or people of a certain income, or, gay people, or two-spirit folks. We all carry biases about groups. And it's really important to become aware of what those are, especially as a white person. And this is where I think it really plays out so importantly, because racism is such a prevalent system in this country. White people, when it's implicit for us, we carry out things in the system that we're in every day, and we keep it racist, right? Like, that's why it's so essential for white people to figure out how their implicit bias is working in their life, because then they can start to take some small but super important actions to course correct and not do what they've been doing. Again, like, they may not be aware of it, but we are all part of the same system, white people, especially within certain systems of power. And so we have to be able to adjust what we do on a daily basis to shift that system. We have that power.
Yeah. Absolutely.
For now. Hopefully it won't be always white people in power.
Yeah, and you're making me think about the person at the child welfare office or the unemployment office that has a bias about a particular group of people. They're gatekeepers.
Yep. That's right, to resources. That's right.
That's right. They impact the statistics.
Yeah. Well, they're not just gatekeepers for resources. They're the decision makers when children are removed from their home.
That's right.
Or
Absolutely.
They're not given back to their parents, or
That's right.
There's some. But thankfully, like, this revolution, may have started with police brutality, but it's spilling out. Like, it's looking at education systems and social service systems, and like, that's what a revolution is about.
That's right.
So that's awesome. So we have 5 minutes left, and I know there's just like so much here. So I'm gonna ask, the last couple of things. So what word of advice or guidance would you give to people that want to be an ally to communities of color? So what advice or guidance would you give? And, you know, in my world, of course, healing is the answer to everything, right? And so I know that, you know, racism is trauma, or, you know, but healing needs to happen for white people too, right? So what advice or guidance would you give to people that want to be a better ally to communities of color? And while you do that, you both have sent some really good resources. While you're talking, I'm going to share my screen and share some of the resources that you sent.
Sure.
Cool.
So whichever one of you wants to go first.
Go ahead, Wendi.
Sure. Yeah, I guess just off the top of my head, I'd say, you know, find other white people who are doing this work and work with them. You know, get that support going. A friend of mine, a white friend of mine, reflected to me yesterday. Oh, and that's another example of implicit bias. Did you see what I just did when I said a friend of mine and didn't clarify what race the person was? White people do that all the time, right? Like we just say that person, but it's usually that's because it's a white person that I'm thinking of, and I expect everybody else to think that. Like that is implicit bias. And you just saw me do it, right? Like that's how insidious it is in our way of thinking and talking. So, which is another way that white people can, you know, correct course and learn more about how to not do things like that. So, a white friend of mine was talking with me last night about how, you know, white people have this, like, also this spiritual, like, who are they? They're settlers, right? It's talking about settler colonialism. Like we're not on our own land. Our families historically come from other places than the United States. And so when we start unpacking all of this privilege that we've got, it can be a rough journey if you don't kind of know who you are or where you belong. And then it starts to get tough and it feels very isolating. So definitely find good folks and draw upon resources like what Jillene is showing and the internet. Get into a group. Like there's a lot of really cool book clubs that are popping up, and that is not a big step, but it's a step in the right direction to educate yourself about what it is we need to unpack and address as white people. So find support and engage every day, no matter how small it is with your engagement. That's what I see a lot of progressive white people doing, is not engaging in a lot of the actions. They engage in a lot of the self-indulgence of, you know, I'm learning more about myself and I'm becoming more, you know, self-determined. It's like, okay, well, you're also being very privileged and just reading about racism and not experiencing it every day. So get out there and do something about it is very important.
Nice. Thank you, Wendi. How about you, Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Wendi said. And then I just, you know, around language again, I don't think it's unusual that, you know, so ally can be it's an awkward word. And you'll hear people say, oh, ally, you know, you should be an accomplice. Like, you know, so it's because we don't have a word for this kind of action where white people are deciding to make a decision to support other folks and call out the culture for what it is. There's not a word that feels comfortable. So ally is fine, but also to know that, you know, you'll never achieve allyhood because you're going to bump into stuff all the way through for the rest of your life. You're going to continue to learn. You're going to continue to make mistakes. So ally is about the action. Take the action.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any action, just take an action. And in that action where you're showing up, in that act, that's an ally action. Do it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both so much. So I just showed several resources. Wendi and Lynn both contributed some resources. I have a bunch of resources. And so we're going to put them on our website, and we're also going to put them on our Facebook page as a starting point. Like there's literally tons of books and podcasts and articles and, you know, things like that to help us all learn about, you know, the just the breakdown of racism. And, you know, I always say like racism and oppression is like COVID-19, like it's stealth-like, right? It's like stealth-like. And so when we when we can name things, right, and help us, all of us, like better, you know, better understand everything. So we're already at 1 o'clock already. This went by so fast, and my brain is already thinking about part 2 and the things that we can. One of the things I want to do for part 2 is like, how do we help people who may be at the giving end or the receiving end of racism? What can we do to help both sides, right? How can we help people respond in a good way? And I'm so appreciative of this conversation because, and I keep pointing this out to people, we can have these conversations without yelling and screaming and blaming and judging and, you know, all that kind of stuff, just like we did for the past hour. Like this was an awesome conversation, you know, so thank you both for that. And again, we want to thank everyone for tuning in. Please share this with your family and friends. Like this is an action, sharing something like this that gets people thinking, you know, gets our worldview, you know, opening up a little bit more, helps us to understand here and helps us to understand here. We also want to give thanks to the Indian Collective who are helping to support our power hours, and we're grateful for that as well. So thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Wendi. Thank you for just the amazing examples that you are, the work that you do personally, and that you take this on to call in other white people to help them, you know, understand systemic racism and beyond. Like, I'm super grateful for your friendship and for your allyship. Yeah.
It's the least we could do, Jillene. Thank you for all you do with NWI.
Yes. We'll be back for part 2. Okay.
Y'all are rad. All right. Bye.
Bye.